The cab crept slowly through the evening Fort Wayne, and I clutched the small cardboard box tighter in my lap. The driver mumbled something to himself, glancing in the rearview mirror, but I didn't listen. My thoughts were preoccupied with dinner and what was in the box. Outside the window were the familiar streets I'd walked all my life, the houses where my friends had grown up, the stores where I'd bought groceries when Robert was little. Now, many of those stores were closed, replaced by new places with brightly colored signs and names in languages I didn't understand. 5 years ago, Robert had brought Keisha home, and at the time I'd thought she was smiling too hard. The kind of smile you see on salespeople in expensive stores. Perfect, but cold. She worked at a large law firm, wore strict suits, and talked about her career like it was a religion. Robert looked at her admiringly, and I watched her appraisingly look around our old house, the furniture my late husband and I had bought piecemeal. Her gaze slid over the worn armrests of the chairs, the sun-bleached curtains, the plain-framed family photos, and I could feel her mentally calculating the value of all that stuff. Robert had said then that she was smart, determined, that she had big plans. He said it with such enthusiasm, as if intelligence and ambition were incredibly rare qualities. Keisha smiled modestly and added something about the importance of family values, but I could see her manicured fingers tapping nervously on the table as the conversation dragged on. She was in a hurry, always in a hurry to get somewhere, even when she was sitting still. "Mrs. Reynolds, do you mind if I move some things around?" She asked me a week after the wedding when I went to visit them. Just to make it cozier. I didn't mind. At the time, I thought it was normal for a young wife to want to organize the house to her liking. But gradually, not only my pictures disappeared from the walls, but also I myself from their lives, imperceptibly at first, carefully. Keisha never explicitly said she didn't need me. She simply created circumstances where my presence became inappropriate or impossible. She always found reasons why I couldn't come to my grandchildren's birthday parties or family gatherings. The kids had colds, or they were too tired, or plans changed at the last minute. When I offered to help with cooking for the party, she said she had already ordered everything from the restaurant. When I wanted to babysit my grandchildren while they went to the theater, it turned out that the tickets were canceled. When I gave the kids gifts, Keisha would thank me, but then those toys would disappear. Too noisy, too small of a detail, didn't fit the nursery decor. Robert called less and less often, and when I dialed his number myself, I could hear children's voices in the background, but somehow they didn't reach me. Keisha always found an explanation. Haley was doing homework. Ethan was sleeping. They had company. "Sorry, Mom. Some other time." And Robert obediently repeated these excuses, even though he used to come to me every weekend, talking about work, asking for advice. Now he got all his advice from his wife. I remembered him telling me about his dreams when he was a teenager. He wanted to be an architect, to build beautiful houses, to create something meaningful. Instead, he worked as a manager for a construction company, signing contracts for model cottages in new neighborhoods. Keisha said it was promising, that real estate was a stable business. Robert agreed. He'd started agreeing a lot after he got married. The driver slowed at a red light, and I looked out the window at the familiar streets. This was where I'd lived all my life, where Robert had been born and raised, and now he lived in a new neighborhood where the houses looked like twins and the lawns were mowed with mathematical precision. Keisha picked this house, of course. She chose a lot of things for my son in general, from where he lived to the make of the car. I remembered the day they announced the move. Keisha sat next to Robert on my couch and held his hand as she explained the benefits of the new neighborhood. Better schools for the kids, convenient transportation, upscale neighbors. Robert nodded, and I saw him occasionally glance at the old photos on the walls, his high school pictures, our family trips to the lake, the day he graduated from college. "It'll be a long drive from my mom," he said then. "But it's only 20 minutes by car," Keisha replied quickly. "And anyway, we should be thinking about our kids' future, not clinging to the past." The past. That's what she called my life, our traditions, the memories that bound me and Robert together. It was all the past that was getting in the way of moving forward. "Robert, why don't we invite Mom over for Christmas?" I heard his voice on the phone 2 years ago when I happened to come to the door early and he was talking in the hallway. "Are you serious?" Keisha replied, and there was so much contempt in her tone that my insides clenched. "She's going to tell her endless stories about your father again, and kids are too active to sit around and listen to old memories." Robert mumbled something indistinctly, but I knew he wasn't going to argue. He'd stopped arguing with his wife altogether, as if it took too much effort, or as if he was afraid she would find a way to punish him for disobedience. I could see him shrink back when she spoke harshly, how he avoided looking her in the eye when she criticized his decisions. After that conversation, I spent Christmas alone, sitting in an empty house, watching old movies and thinking about how my husband and I used to celebrate the holiday when Robert was little. How he woke up before everyone else, ran to the tree, unwrapped presents with such delight as if each box contained a real miracle. How we'd bake cookies together and he'd smear more icing on his nose than on the cookies. It was then, in that Christmas loneliness, that I first had the thought of learning more about Keisha, not out of curiosity, out of necessity. I realized I was losing my son, and I wanted to understand who I was losing him to. So I started simple. I found her profile on social media, read articles in her firm's corporate magazine, talked to a neighbor who knew one of her colleagues. Gradually, a picture began to emerge. Keisha was ambitious, but not as talented as she wanted to appear. Her career progression was faster than one would expect from someone with her experience. I opened the box and looked inside. Documents lay in a neat stack, some in file folders, others stapled together. Photos were on top, not great quality, but clear enough. It had taken 6 months to put it all together. 6 months of painstaking work, talking to the right people, fact-checking. It turned out that the world of jurisprudence, like everywhere else, has its dirty secrets, information that is not transmitted through official channels, documents that get copied and disappear from cases, witnesses who change testimony after informal meetings. Keisha knew more about this world than an honest lawyer should. I talked to a former clerk at her firm who was fired under bizarre circumstances, to a secretary who happened to overhear phone conversations, to a person on the opposing side in one of the cases who changed his position too abruptly in court. Slowly, the puzzle added up, and I realized that my sister-in-law's career wasn't built on professional merit alone. Keisha thought I was an old fool who didn't understand anything about the modern world. She was wrong. I understood more than she thought. I understood, for example, that a successful career in a law firm sometimes isn't built on talent alone. I understood that some cases are won not because of a brilliant knowledge of the law, but because of information that lawyers shouldn't have. Gathering evidence was not easy. I'm 73 years old. I'm not a detective or a journalist, but I had what the young lacked: time and patience. I could sit in the coffee shop outside Keisha's office for hours, watching who she was meeting with, writing down license plates, memorizing faces. I could pretend I was a confused old lady who got lost in an office building and talk to the security guard or the janitor. People willingly talk to older women. We seem safe, non-threatening. The hardest part was getting copies of documents, but even here my age helped. Who would suspect a 73-year-old grandmother of industrial espionage? I introduced myself as the aunt of one of the employees, said I wanted to surprise him on his birthday, and asked him to show me where he worked. Kind people were happy to give me a tour, and I memorized the location of offices, security systems, and the habits of the staff. Here we are, the driver said, and I shuddered. Robert and Keisha's house stood at the end of a quiet street, surrounded by young trees and immaculate flower beds. 2 stories, big windows, a porch with white columns, just like in a country life magazine. The lawn was perfectly mowed. The driveway was tiled with expensive tiles. Even the mailbox looked like a work of art. Keisha had achieved what she'd dreamed of, a home she could show off to coworkers and clients without shame. I paid the toll and slowly walked up the walkway to the front door. The lights were on in the windows, and I could see silhouettes in the dining room. Keisha was talking animatedly, waving her arms. Robert was nodding, and the kids were running between rooms. The usual family idyll that had no room for me. But that would change today. The box in my hands felt heavier than it was. In it lay a future, mine and Keisha's, documents that could ruin her career, photos that would call her reputation into question, tapes of conversations that would interest law enforcement. For 5 years, I'd put up with her neglect. 5 years, I'd watched her alienate my son and grandchildren from me. But patience is not an infinite resource. I rang the doorbell and prepared to wait. Keisha was never in a hurry to open the door for me, probably wanted to show that my visit was an inconvenience, a disruption to their plans. I heard her voice in the house, saying something to Robert, then children's voices, stomping feet. At last, footsteps were heard, and the door swung open. "Oh, Mrs. Reynolds." Keisha smiled that same salesman's smile. "How nice of you to be able to come." She was dressed in a light dress, hair neatly styled, flawless makeup on her face. Keisha always looked like she was getting ready for a photo shoot for the family magazine, even at home, even on a casual evening. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. The same cold irritation I'd seen all these years was there. "Come in, please." She stepped aside, and I stepped over the threshold. There was that tense silence in the living room that happens when everyone pretends to be happy to see each other. Robert rose from the couch, where he'd been sitting with the tablet in his hands, and awkwardly hugged me with one arm, not letting go of the device with the other. His hug was formal, like a handshake with a stranger. Once he'd hugged me tightly, pressed his cheek against my shoulder, and I could sense that he was genuinely happy to see me. "Hi, Mom," he said, and I could hear the tiredness in his voice. "How are you doing? How was your drive?" I wanted to tell him about the traffic on Main Street, about how the cab driver didn't know the way to their house, and I had to explain, but Keisha had already moved closer, and her presence cut off any attempt at normal conversation. "Robert, help Mom take off her coat," she said in the tone she used to instruct the servants. "I'll go check on dinner." Robert obediently took my coat and hung it in the closet. I noticed his shoulders slouch as his wife gave him orders. He used to stand up straight, proud, but years of living with Keisha had made his movements cautious, as if he was constantly expecting criticism. The living room was furnished in what designers call modern minimalism: white walls, a gray sofa, a glass coffee table with nothing extra on it, no family photos, no children's drawings on the refrigerator, no traces of real life. Everything looked as if no one lived here, but only posed for a furniture catalog. "Mommy, Mommy," voices rang out, and my grandchildren burst into the living room. Haley ran ahead, her long brown hair waving behind her. She looked just like Robert at her age, the same brown eyes, the same open smile. Behind her was 6-year-old Ethan, chubby and ruddy, with a curl on top of his head that no comb could tame. "Grandma Dorothy," Haley screamed and rushed over to me. I barely had time to set the box on the coffee table before the girl was hanging around my neck. Her hug was so genuine, so joyful, it made my eyes water. This was the real feeling, not fake, not driven by some ulterior motive. "Did you bring us anything?" Ethan asked, peering into the box with the curiosity typical of all children. Ethan, don't touch Grandma's stuff, Keisha said sternly, appearing in the kitchen doorway. And in general, you should wash your hands before dinner. The children immediately pulled away from me, and I saw a familiar expression appear on their faces, a mixture of fear and resignation. They loved their mother but feared her displeasure. Keisha ruled the family with an iron hand, and even the children knew it was best not to cross her. Can I show Grandma my drawing? Haley asked timidly. After dinner, Keisha said. We have to eat first, and then we have fun. Haley lowered her head and walked silently to the couch. I saw her shoulders slump, and my heart sank with pity. An 8-year-old girl shouldn't be so afraid of her mother. Children should feel free to be at home, to laugh, to run, to make noise. But in this house, different rules reigned. Ethan settled down next to his father and began to whisper something in his ear, pointing to the clipboard. Robert nodded and answered quietly, trying not to attract his wife's attention. Even with his own children, he was cautious, as if he was afraid Keisha would find a reason to criticize him. Robert, put that tablet away, Keisha said without turning around. We agreed no gadgets during family time. Robert immediately tucked the tablet under the couch cushion, and I noticed how quickly he did it. The movement was practiced, automatic. How many times had he had to hide his interests, his desires, to avoid annoying his wife? I sat down in the chair across from the couch and looked around the room. There were abstract paintings in expensive frames on the walls, but not a single family photo. On the shelves were books that no one had read. The spines were too smooth, too clean. Everything in this room spoke of status, of wealth, of the impression one wanted to make on one's guests. Grandma, are you going to live with us? Ethan asked suddenly. There was silence in the room. Keisha turned abruptly from the kitchen door, where she stood checking something on her phone. Robert tensed and cast a quick glance at his wife. Haley lifted her head and looked at me expectantly. Ethan, what are you talking about? Keisha said, and her voice turned cold. Grandma has her own house, but I'd like her to be with us, the boy insisted. She can bake cookies, and she has interesting picture books. Picture books are for little kids, Keisha cut him off. You're a big boy. You should read serious books. Ethan shrank back and didn't say anything else. I saw him furtively wipe his eyes with the sleeve of his sweater. The boy just wanted Grandma to be there for him, but even that simple wish was wrong in his mother's eyes. Children, go wash your hands, Keisha said in a commanding tone. Dinner will be ready in 5 minutes. Haley and Ethan obediently got up and headed for the stairs leading to the second floor. I watched them walk away. Two little people who had already learned to suppress their emotions and desires. Their childhood had been under the strict control of their mother, who considered spontaneity to be character flaws. When the children disappeared upstairs, the room fell into awkward silence again. Robert rubbed the edge of the couch cushion and avoided looking me in the eye. Keisha stood by the kitchen, phone in hand, but clearly not reading anything on the screen. She was thinking about something else. How was work, son? I asked, trying to make conversation. It's fine, he replied briefly. Lots of projects, constant work. He used the English word so naturally that he didn't even notice it. Keisha had accustomed him to her language, to the terminology of successful people. Robert used to talk about work simply, like it or dislike it, interesting or boring. Now he operated with the concepts of efficiency and effectiveness. What are the projects? I continued. Robert became animated and started to talk about a new residential complex his company was building. He talked about the layouts, the materials, the deadlines, and I could see his eyes light up. He still liked the work, even though it wasn't exactly what he'd dreamed of. Robert, don't bore Mom with the details of the job. Keisha interrupted him. She doesn't know anything about it. The fire in her son's eyes went out instantly. He lowered his head and said nothing more. I felt anger boiling inside me. Keisha didn't even try to hide her disdain for me or her husband's interests. To her, we were both second-class citizens. I was just about to tell you about my new case, Keisha said, sitting down in the chair across from me. It's a very interesting case. Big corporation, international contracts. She started talking about some kind of dispute between the companies, using a lot of legal terms and clearly enjoying the fact that I didn't understand half the words. It was her way of showing her superiority, demonstrating her knowledge and my ignorance. Robert listened to his wife with a look of interest, but I knew him well enough to realize he was just feigning attention. His thoughts were somewhere far away, perhaps in a time when he could still speak freely about what he cared about. Of course, the details of the case are confidential, Keisha continued, but I can tell you that the stakes are very high. If we win, it will bring the firm several $1 million. She said the amount with a special meaning, as if she wanted to emphasize the difference between our worlds. Her world is millions, success, prestige. My world is retirement, lonely evenings, and memories of the past. From upstairs came the voices of children and the sound of running water. They were washing their hands as their mother had ordered. I imagined them standing at the sink, obediently soaping their hands and thinking about what would happen next. Would they see Grandma after dinner? Will Mom allow them to show their drawings? Or will they be sent back to bed without being able to talk to each other? Mommy, did you bring us presents? Came Haley's voice from the stairs. Haley, don't yell from the stairs, Keisha said sharply. And don't beg for presents. It's rude. The girl was silent, and I heard her feet slowly descending the stairs. Ethan stomped after her, apparently not knowing how to walk quietly. When they appeared in the living room, I saw that Haley's eyes were red. She'd been crying. Come here, honey, I said, and the girl ran over to me. I hugged her and felt her skinny shoulders shake. An 8-year-old child should not be afraid to ask her grandmother for a present. It's the most natural thing in the world, but Keisha had managed to make it an occasion for shame. I do have something for you, I said, looking at Keisha. But it's at home. I'll bring it next time. That's nice, Keisha said, and there was no sincerity in her voice. Kids, sit down at the table. Dinner is ready. We moved into the dining room, where beautiful plates and shiny utensils stood on a white tablecloth. Everything looked perfect, like in a restaurant. Containers from expensive catering were flaunting on the table. No homey smells, no warmth of a family kitchen. Keisha was seating everyone with the look of a director arranging the actors on stage. Robert sat to her right. The kids sat across from each other, and I got a seat at the end of the table, where it was awkward to reach the communal dishes. Symbolically, I was a second-class guest even at the family table. Dinner began with Keisha arranging the food from the containers with the air of a hostess who'd worked all day at the stove. She did it defiantly, talking to the children about the benefits of vegetables and the importance of a balanced diet, as if she'd cooked it all herself rather than ordering it from the restaurant around the corner. The smell was pleasant but impersonal. No home cooking aromas, no childhood memories of Mom's cutlets or Grandma's pies. I moved the box from the floor to my lap, holding it tightly against my stomach. It didn't weigh much, but the contents pressed on me with all their importance. The papers inside could change everything. The balance of power in this family, Keisha's attitude toward me, maybe even the future of my grandchildren. Robert didn't know I was holding a weapon against his wife. Not yet. Haley, keep your back straight, Keisha said, adjusting her daughter's shoulders. And don't smear the sauce on your plate. Eat it neat. The girl immediately straightened up and began to eat small, careful bites. Every movement of the fork was controlled by the mother's gaze. I remembered feeding Robert myself when he was a baby. He could spill soup, stain his shirt, laugh with his mouth full, and that was okay. Children should be children, not little robots programmed to behave perfectly. Ethan, don't chatter your feet, Keisha continued. And stop playing with your food. The boy froze as if he'd been caught in the act. He was just putting the peas in small piles, a common childhood amusement. But in this house, even such little things were considered indecent. Robert sat in silence, occasionally glancing at his cell phone, which lay next to his plate. The screen lit up with incoming messages, and each time he reached for the device, but stopped when he caught his wife's gaze. Keisha didn't say anything, but her disapproval was felt even without words. "Robert, we have company," she finally said, though I was the only guest. "Can't work wait?" "I'm sorry," he mumbled and flipped the phone screen down. I could see him nervously clenching and unclenching his fingers. Maybe it was an important client or coworker calling, maybe some urgent matter, but Keisha didn't see fit to consider it. Her rules were more important than his work. "By the way," Keisha began, turning to me with a smile that didn't touch her eyes, "we have a lot of plans for the near future. Robert got a promotion and we're thinking about buying a bigger house." This was news to me, but Robert didn't look pleased. He continued to eat mechanically, not lifting his eyes from his plate. The promotion should have been a cause for pride, but my son looked more tired than happy. "Congratulations," I said. "That's wonderful." "Yes, we're very pleased," Keisha continued. "The new position requires more responsibility, more time, so Robert will have to travel a lot. But it's a good salary." She said it as if she were reading the resume of a successful employee. Not a word about how it would affect the children, who would see less of their father. Not a word about how Robert felt about the change. Just numbers, status, career advancement. "How do the kids feel about it?" I asked, looking at the grandchildren. "The kids understand that Daddy is working for their future," Keisha answered quickly. "Don't they, Haley?" The girl nodded, but I could see she didn't understand what she was talking about. An 8-year-old can't grasp the concept of a career path. He just wants Daddy to be home and read bedtime stories. "We also plan to send the kids to private school," Keisha continued. "Education is an investment in the future. Sure, it's expensive, but we're willing to make sacrifices for the kids." Sacrifices. I wonder who exactly will make the sacrifices? The kids who will lose friends at the old school? Robert, who will work even harder to pay for a prestigious education? Or maybe me, who will completely disappear from their lives because private school will require an even busier schedule. "What about their friends?" I asked. "They will have to break up with their classmates." "Kids adapt quickly," Keisha said. "And at the new school, they'll be surrounded by kids from good families. It's important to form the right bonds, the right connections, good families." Keisha talked about her children as if they were business projects that needed to be executed to the best of their ability. Love, affection, emotional needs, all took a back seat to social status. "Mom, what is proper bonding?" Ethan asked. "It's when you make friends with children whose parents can be useful in the future," Keisha answered without a shadow of embarrassment. The 6-year-old boy frowned, trying to understand his mother's logic. He didn't yet know that friendship could be a tool for career advancement. In his world, friends were those who were fun to play with, shared toys, and didn't hurt others. But Keisha was already beginning to mold him into a different view of human relationships. "By the way," Keisha said, turning to me, "we're planning to spend our summer vacation in Europe, an educational tour of the capitals of culture. It's good for kids to see the world, broaden their horizons. It was another way of showing me my place, expensive travel, cultural tours, all the things I couldn't afford in retirement." Keisha was painting a picture of a life that had no room for a poor old grandmother. Sounds wonderful, I said, trying to keep my tone even. How long do you plan to be away? 3 weeks, Keisha answered. Maybe 4. Depends on how much the kids like it. Robert looked up from his plate and glanced quickly at his mother. Perhaps he realized that a month's absence of grandchildren would be painful for me. But he didn't say anything, just went back to eating. Would Robert be able to take a vacation for that long? I continued. Robert won't come with us, Keisha said. He has too much work to do. Besides, men aren't really interested in museums and architecture. The kids and I will do just fine. So Robert would stay home alone, work even harder to pay for the trip, and Keisha and the kids would enjoy their European vacation, and no one asked his opinion about it. Mom, can Grandma Dorothy come with us? Haley suddenly asked. Silence hung in the dining room. Keisha froze with her fork in her hand. Robert looked up sharply. Ethan looked curiously at all the adults. The child's question was so simple and logical that the adults didn't know how to answer it. Haley, don't be silly, Keisha said, but there was irritation in her voice. Grandma's too old to be traveling like this. It'll be hard on her. But she doesn't walk with a stick, she said, and she told us about France. Remember, Ethan, about the Eiffel Tower and the museum with the paintings. Ethan nodded vigorously. Apparently, I had once told them about my trip to Paris with my late husband. That was 40 years ago, but the memory of that trip was still one of the most vivid in my life. Children, don't interfere with adult conversations, Keisha said sharply. And, in fact, finish your food as fast as you can. You have school tomorrow, and it's time to get ready for bed. Haley lowered her head and stopped talking. Ethan stopped asking questions, too. One short shout from his mother, and the childlike directness was quelled. I gripped the box tighter in my lap. The documents inside rustled with my touch, reminding me of their existence. 5 years I'd endured this treatment. 5 years I'd watched Keisha methodically push me out of the family's life. But the kids still remembered me, still wanted me around, and that gave me hope. Keisha, Robert said suddenly, maybe you should think about. Think about what? His wife interrupted him. We've got it all worked out. The itinerary, the hotels, the excursions. Why complicate everything? Robert was silent again. He didn't even have time to finish his thought, but Keisha had already cut off any possibility of discussion. She was the only one who made decisions in this family. Robert's phone lit up again, and this time he couldn't resist grabbing the device and quickly running his eyes over the message. His face changed, becoming concerned. What's wrong? Keisha asked, noticing his reaction. Problems with the North Street project, he replied. The contractor is behind schedule, and the client is threatening to cancel the contract. So what now? We have to go to the site, get a handle on the situation. We might have to spend the whole night there. Keisha pressed her lips together. Apparently, she was looking forward to a quiet family evening that she could show me as a model of a perfect life. Can't delegate to someone else? She asked. The customer wants to speak to me personally, Robert replied. If I don't go, we'll lose the contract. And that's a lot of money. A lot of money. The magic phrase that justified any sacrifice. Robert would miss the rest of the family dinner. He wouldn't read to the kids. He wouldn't talk to me, but the contract would be saved. Okay, Keisha sighed, but try to be back early tomorrow. We have a meeting with the principal of the new school. Robert nodded and began to finish his meal in a hurry. He was clearly in a hurry to leave, and I thought that maybe work was a way for him to escape the stress of home. At the office, he could be himself, make decisions, feel like a man. At home, he was just Keisha's husband and the father of her children. I'm sorry, Mom, he said, getting up from the table. I wish I could have spent more time with you. It's okay, son, I replied. Work is work. He leaned over and kissed me on the cheek. His hand rested on my shoulder for a moment, and I felt his touch apologizing for everything, for his wife's coldness, for his infrequent phone calls, for letting things get so bad. "Bye, Daddy," the children said, but Robert was already hurrying toward the exit. A few minutes later, we heard the sound of a car starting up. Robert drove away, leaving me alone with Keisha and the kids. Now my sister-in-law didn't have to pretend to be happy about my visit. Now she could show her true feelings for me. "Well," Keisha said as she started to gather the plates, "we'll have to finish dinner without Robert." She did it defiantly slowly, as if to show that I was now a greater inconvenience. Without her husband, she had to do the hospitality herself, and it was clearly annoying. "May I help?" I offered. "No," Keisha refused. "I have my own system." "Of course you do." Everything in this house was her system, from the kids' schedules to the family dinner menu. And in that system, there was no room for spontaneity, for warmth, for a grandmother who could disrupt the order. I continued to sit at the table, holding the box in my lap. The kids were finishing their portions, glancing at me from time to time. Haley clearly wanted to say something, but was afraid of her mom's disapproval. Ethan was swinging his legs under the table, despite the prohibition, and I could see that Keisha was noticing it but tolerating it for now. The atmosphere in the dining room was becoming increasingly tense. Without Robert, the last semblance of family harmony was gone. All that was left was us two women of different generations who didn't like each other, and two children who felt the tension but didn't understand the reasons for it. The box in my lap seemed the only reality in this theater of perfect life. Soon I would open it and everything would change. But for now, I sat and watched and waited for the right moment. After Robert left, there was a silence in the house, broken only by the clinking of plates as Keisha ostentatiously cleared the table, making each movement emphatically abrupt. The children sat there, having finished eating, unsure of what to do next. Usually at this time, Daddy played with them or read a book, but now they were on their own. "Mommy, can we show Grandma our rooms?" Haley asked timidly. "After you brush your teeth and get ready for bed," Keisha said without turning around. "You have school tomorrow. You can't stay up late." "But it's only 8 o'clock," Ethan objected. "8 o'clock is late for kids your age," his mother said. "Go upstairs." The children reluctantly got up from the table and headed for the stairs. Haley turned and waved at me, and Ethan sent me a kiss. I smiled back at them, feeling my heart clench with pity. They'd spent so little time with me, and it was already time to part. When the stomping of children's feet died down upstairs, Keisha finally turned to me. There was no longer a hint of a polite smile on her face. Now that the kids weren't around, she didn't have to pretend. "You know, Mrs. Reynolds," she began, leaning against the kitchen island, "I think it's time we had a frank talk." I gripped the box tighter and prepared to attack. Keisha's voice had that cold determination I'd heard in court on TV when the lawyers read the indictments. "I understand that you miss your family," she continued, "but I have to be blunt. Your constant visits are starting to interfere with our lives." "Interfere?" I questioned her. "I'm the grandmother of those children." "Yes, you are," Keisha agreed. "But times have changed. Modern families live differently. We have our own plans, our own way of raising children. And you, forgive me for being blunt, but you're from a different generation. A different generation. Like it was a disease that made me unfit to interact with my own grandchildren." Keisha said it as if my age automatically disqualified me from being part of the family. "Kids love me," I said quietly. "Kids love ice cream and cartoons," Keisha said. "That doesn't mean ice cream is good for them every day. You spoil them. You tell them old-fashioned fairy tales. You give them the wrong ideas about life. Wrong ideas. So telling them that friendship is more important than money, that you have to be kind to people, that family is as much about status as it is about love were misconceptions. Keisha, I never interfered with your parenting methods. I tried to justify myself. You didn't? She grinned. What about your comments about private school? Your questions about our plans? You think the kids don't hear that? They start questioning our decisions, asking unnecessary questions. Unnecessary questions. For Keisha, even children's curiosity was a problem to be solved. Children were supposed to blindly trust their parents' decisions and not question them. And your presents, she continued, speeding away. Those cheap toys that break after a week. Picture books that aren't appropriate for their age. You want to be a beloved grandmother, but you don't realize you're hurting your children. Cheap toys. She's right. I couldn't buy expensive gifts with my pension. But the kids were happy with simple things because it wasn't the price that mattered, it was the attention. That's what Keisha couldn't understand. And those stories about your dead husband, she said, I'm not gonna stop. Children should look to the future, not listen to stories about how people lived 50 years ago. It's depressing and useless. Stories about a grandfather the children had never seen but had grown to love because of my stories. I told them about how kind and funny their grandpa was, how he knew how to fix broken toys and bake pancakes on Sundays. For Keisha, these were depressing and useless memories. The voices of children came from upstairs. They were brushing their teeth and getting ready for bed. Soon Keisha would send them to bed, and I would leave the house without telling them. As usual, our meeting would be short and formal. Look, Keisha said, coming closer. I don't mean to be cruel, but someone has to tell you the truth. You're a lonely old woman clinging to the past. But we're living in the present and building a future. A lonely old woman. That's how she saw me, a pathetic creature who was preventing a young, successful family from living their lives. A woman who had no right to a place in the modern world. We have plans, ambitions, goals, Keisha continued. We want to give our children the best education, show them the world, teach them how to be successful. And you, what can you give them? Outdated values and sentimental fairy tales? What can I give them? Unconditional love, acceptance without the requirement to conform to some standard, the opportunity to just be kids, not projects to fulfill parental ambitions. But that had no value to Keisha. Robert is too kind to tell you this directly, she continued, but I can see him tense up before your visits. He feels guilty that he can't give you more time, and I don't want him to suffer for a sense of duty. Robert's suffering from a sense of obligation? Or because his wife forbids him from having normal contact with his mother? Keisha masterfully turned the situation around, turning herself into her husband's protector from his obsessive mother-in-law. Besides, she added, children grow up. They have their own interests, their own friends. They need modern role models, not, sorry to be blunt, but not relics of the past. Remnants of the past. That's what she called me openly now. Not a grandmother, not Robert's mother, but a relic to be rid of for the sake of a brighter future. At that moment, Ethan's voice came from upstairs. Mom, can we stay with Grandma a little longer? No, Keisha shouted up the stairs. Go to bed, and no talking. The voices upstairs fell silent. The children realized it was useless to argue. They'd go to bed and I'd leave without a proper goodbye, like I always do. See, Keisha said, turning to me, they don't listen when you're here. They think they can bargain, beg for favors. It undermines our parental authority. Parental authority. Not love, not care, but authority. Children were expected to obey without question, and any doubts about their parents' decisions were seen as a threat to the system. I think, Keisha continued, that we should rethink your visitation schedule. Maybe once every 2 months, or on major holidays. Every 2 months. That's 6 times a year. And then it'll seem too frequent. The kids will forget me, get used to life without their grandmother, and eventually I'll disappear from their world completely. Maybe you should find a hobby, she suggested with fake caring. A hobby club, volunteering, something like that. Single people should have their own lives, not be dependent on other people's families. Alien family, that's what she called my son's family. I was a stranger in the house where my child grew up, where my grandchildren live. Listen, Keisha, I started, but she interrupted me. No, you listen to me. Her voice became harsh, angry. The mask of politeness had completely fallen off. I'm sick of pretending. I'm sick of being polite to you when you're interfering with our lives. She came very close, and I saw real hatred in her eyes. Not just annoyance or impatience, but hatred. Do you think I don't understand what you're doing? She continued. You're trying to turn the children against me with your sweet talk about how good life used to be. You want them to question my decisions. That's not true, I objected. It's not true, she laughed. And your question about friends? And your offer to take you to Europe? You deliberately create situations where I look angry and you look like an understanding grandmother. Maybe she was right about something. Maybe I really was subconsciously trying to show my kids an alternative to the world they live in. But is that a bad thing? And your son, Keisha pointed to the door through which Robert had left. He feels guilty every time you come over, tormented that he can't spend more time with you. And I don't want my husband to suffer because of your selfishness. Selfishness. So wanting to see your son and grandchildren was selfish. Wanting to be part of the family was selfish. Love was selfish. You know what the funny thing is? Keisha continued. You think you're better than me. You think your love is more right, more real. But look at you, a pathetic old woman who clings to other people because she has no life of her own. Strangers. My son is a stranger. My grandchildren are strangers. In Keisha's mouth, I was becoming a parasite that feeds on other people's happiness. I have an education, a career, plans for my future, she continued. What do you have? An empty house, memories of the past, and an obsessive need to meddle in our lives. An empty house. Yes, my house was empty after my husband died. But it was full of memories, full of the love that Robert Sr. and I had spent years creating. That was something Keisha couldn't understand. And the most disgusting thing, her voice grew more and more angry, is that you spoil my children with your sentimentality, teaching them to feel sorry for losers, to dream unfulfilled dreams, to cling to the past. My children. Haley and Ethan were her property to protect from their grandmother's harmful influence. Do you want them to grow up to be losers like you? Keisha continued. To settle for less, to not strive for success? A loser. That's how she saw my life. A string of failures and missed opportunities. 45 years of happy marriage, raising a son who became a good man, years as an elementary school teacher. All of it was failure in her mind. Guess what? Keisha straightened to her full height and looked down at me. I'm sick of this pretense. I'm sick of pretending I'm happy to see you. I'm sick of having you in my house. My house. Not the family home, not Robert's home, but her home. It was no place for anyone but those she deemed worthy. You are a disgrace to the family, she shouted at last. Get out. Get out of our lives and don't stop us from building a future. A disgrace to the family. Those words hit me like a slap in the face. I, who had birthed and raised Robert, who loved these children more than life, was a disgrace to the family in this woman's eyes. At that moment, Robert's cell phone vibrated in his pocket, which he had left on the chair. Keisha turned around at the sound, and I took advantage of the moment. I got up from my seat, clutching the box tightly in my hands. You know what, Keisha? I said quietly but clearly. You're right. It's time we had a frank talk. I set the box on the coffee table and slowly opened the lid. Inside were neatly folded documents, photos, and file folders. Keisha looked at the contents of the box, and her expression began to change. "What is this?" she asked, and for the first time all evening, there was uncertainty in her voice. I took the top folder and opened it. Inside were pictures, not very clear, but clear enough to see what was going on in them. Keisha in a restaurant with a man who was definitely not her husband. Keisha receiving an envelope from the same man. Keisha in an office building with opposing counsel in one of her cases. "Where did you get this?" Keisha whispered, and her face turned pale. "And these," I said, pulling out the next folder, "are phone records. I wonder what your firm's management thinks about exactly how you get information on cases." Keisha gripped the back of her chair. Her confidence was evaporating, replaced by confusion and fear. "And these," I showed her the last folder, "are bank records. Quite large sums are deposited into your account at a very convenient time, just before your cases are adjudicated." "You? How did you?" "Me?" I said, looking her in the eye. "I'm just a pathetic old woman with no education and no career. How am I supposed to know such complicated things?" Keisha stood silent, staring at the papers. Her hands were shaking, and I could see that she was trying to figure out how serious this was, if there was any way out of it. "You know what the most interesting thing is?" I continued. "I've been putting all this together for 6 months. 6 months of hard work. It turns out that relics of the past can have a lot of free time to do things like this." Keisha's face twisted in horror. She realized that her brilliant career, her reputation, her future, everything hangs in the balance. And that hair was in the hands of the very same pathetic old woman she had just called the disgrace of the family. Keisha stood staring at the open box as if it were a bomb with a countdown timer. Her breathing had become shallow. Her face had taken on an unhealthy pallor. The woman who a moment ago had so confidently called me the disgrace of the family now looked like a cornered animal. I slowly pulled the thick folder labeled Harrison Veers MedTech Corp. Out of the box and placed it on the coffee table next to the photos. Keisha jerked as if she wanted to grab the folder, but stopped, realizing the pointlessness of the gesture. "October 23rd of last year," I began in a calm tone. "You met with David Sterling at the Blue Ocean restaurant. He was representing the opposing party in a case your firm had been handling for 8 months. It was, it was a chance meeting." Keisha tried to defend herself, but her voice shook. "Accidental?" I opened the folder and showed her the phone records. "Then why did you call him 4 times in the 2 days before this chance meeting? And why did a key witness in the case suddenly change his testimony the day after dinner?" Keisha was silent, and I could see her brain working fast, trying to come up with an explanation. But there was no explanation. The facts spoke for themselves. "This one is particularly interesting," I continued, pulling out another document. "Your bank statement. On October 25th, 2 days after the meeting with Sterling, $50,000 was deposited into your account from a firm that turned out to be a shell company." "Where did you get that?" Keisha whispered. "Bank secrecy." "I have a lot of time and very little fun," I replied. "It's amazing how much you can learn when you really want to, especially about someone who thinks they're too smart to cover their tracks." I could see Keisha trying to remember all her transactions, all her meetings, all her phone calls. How many more of these cases were there? How many times had she sold out her clients' interests? And most importantly, how much evidence of her crimes lay in that box? "Thompson v. Greenwich Construction," I continued, pulling out the next folder. "Your client lost her home because of the construction company's fraudulent scheme. But for some reason, you defended her very sluggishly in court, and key documents disappeared from the case just before the final hearing. Keisha wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to keep warm. Her confidence melted with each new document, each new fact. She realized that she had fallen into a trap from which there was no easy way out. I especially like this picture, I said, showing Keisha leaving an expensive hotel with a representative from Greenwich Construction. A business meeting at the hotel? On a Saturday night? Very unusual for a serious negotiation. You followed me, Keisha said, and there was a metallic note in her voice. It's illegal. It's blackmail. Blackmail? I asked in surprise, but I'm not demanding anything. I'm just showing you some interesting documents. Is it wrong to share information with your family? Keisha realized I was playing her, that she'd been underestimating her opponent all these months. The pathetic old lady was far more dangerous than the successful lawyer had imagined. Quiet voices came from upstairs. The kids were still awake, whispering in their rooms. Haley and Ethan didn't know that their family's fate was being decided downstairs, that their mother was standing on the edge of a precipice, and their grandmother was holding a rope that could save her or push her down. Look, Keisha began, trying to pull herself together. I understand that you're upset. Maybe I was too harsh. But we're reasonable people. We can work things out. Negotiate. Now she wanted to negotiate. The woman who a minute ago called me a disgrace to the family was now willing to compromise. And this is my favorite case, I said, ignoring her words and pulling out another folder. Elizabeth Connor's divorce. Older woman, married for 40 years. Husband has a mistress and wants to leave his wife the bare minimum. You were supposed to be protecting her interests. Keisha turned even paler. Apparently, this was a case she remembered particularly well. But something went wrong, I continued. Suddenly, it turned out that Elizabeth had a secret bank account that she had supposedly forgotten to report. Strangely, this account was discovered by the husband's lawyers just before the crucial hearing. It was a client error. Keisha tried to defend herself. A mistake? I showed her the bank documents. Then why was $30,000 deposited into your personal account the day after the account was discovered from a company owned by Elizabeth's husband? Keisha closed her eyes. She realized that her every case was under surveillance, every questionable transaction recorded. I'd been gathering evidence methodically, patiently, like assembling a mosaic of 1,000 small pieces. Elizabeth Connor lives in a studio apartment now, I said quietly. She is 74 years old. After 40 years of marriage, she received minimal alimony and rented housing, and her husband bought a new house for his young mistress. Yeah, I couldn't have known, Keisha mumbled. You couldn't have known? I pulled out another document. What about this phone recording? You explicitly tell your husband's lawyer where to find Elizabeth's account. The voice on the tape was clear, unmistakable. Keisha sentenced herself, not realizing the conversation was being recorded. It took me a long time to get that tape, but it was worth it. How many more cases like this? Keisha asked hoarsely. Enough, I replied. Enough to give the Bar Association something to work on, and the DA's office, too. Keisha sank into the chair as if her legs were no longer holding her up. All her confidence, all her aplomb, vanished. Before my eyes sat a frightened woman who realized that her carefully constructed world could collapse at any moment. Why are you doing this? She asked. What do you want? What do I want? I interjected. What do you think? Money, she said quickly. I can pay it. How much do you want? Money. Of course, she thought, everything can be bought. That even the love of grandchildren had a price. I have savings, Keisha continued, and I can get a loan. Name the amount. Do you think it's about money? I asked. What else is it about? Keisha looked at me with desperate hope. It's always about money. Name a price. I slowly closed the folders and put them back in the box. Keisha watched my every move, trying to figure out what would happen next. There was a mixture of fear and calculation in her eyes. She was still hoping to find a way to solve the problem. You know what the saddest part is? I said. You still don't get it. You think you can just pay up and it'll all go away. Then what? Keisha sounded desperate. What do you want from me? At that moment, the front door creaked open and Robert entered the house. He looked tired and frustrated. Apparently, things weren't going well on the construction site. Shaking the raindrops off his coat, he walked into the living room and stopped when he saw our scene. What's going on? He asked, looking at his pale wife and at me with the box in my hands. Keisha opened her mouth to say something, but her voice failed her. She sat in the chair with her hands clenched into fists and looked at her husband with the expression of a hunted animal. Keisha and I were just talking, I said calmly. We were discussing family matters. Robert stepped closer and saw the papers spilling out of the box onto the coffee table. His eyes caught on photographs, bank statements, official papers with law firm logos on them. What are these? He asked, picking up one of the photos. The picture was of his wife in an embrace with an unfamiliar man at the entrance to an expensive restaurant. They looked like lovers, not business partners. Robert, I can explain, Keisha said quickly. Explain what? He picked up some more pictures. What kind of man is this? When was this taken? Keisha was silent, and I could see the picture forming in Robert's mind. The photos, the documents, the bank statements, everything spoke for itself. My son was a smart man. He was quick to get the gist of what was going on. Mom, he said, not taking his eyes off the pictures. Where did you get this? I was gathering information, I answered honestly. I wanted to find out who the woman was who had taken my son and grandchildren from me. Robert raised his head and looked at his wife. In his eyes, I saw something I hadn't seen in years: anger. My gentle, malleable son was truly angry. Keisha, he said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. What do these pictures mean? Robert, please. Keisha got up from her chair and tried to approach him, but he backed away. Not everything is as it seems. It's not? He waved the photos in front of her face. How exactly? Did you accidentally trip and fall on this man? Did you accidentally receive money from him? Keisha realized that simple explanations wouldn't work. Robert had seen too much evidence to believe in an innocent accident. Her career built on deception was finally cracking, and that crack was widening before her eyes. Robert, please sit down, she asked. There's something I need to tell you. But Robert did not sit down. He continued to look at the documents, and with each new paper, his face grew more and more stony. Bank statements, phone records, photographs with different men at different times, all painted a picture that could not be explained by chance or misunderstanding. 5 years, he said finally. 5 years you lied to my eyes. Robert, for 5 years I thought I had the perfect wife, he continued, not listening to her. Smart, successful, principled, and it turns out you're just a sellout. The word corrupt sounded like a slap in the face. Keisha flinched as if Robert had actually slapped her. But my son was right. His wife was selling everything: professional honor, client trust, family values. And all this time, Robert turned to me. You knew? Not everything, I answered honestly. But I suspected, and I decided to check it out. Robert nodded and looked at his wife again. There was so much disappointment in his gaze that I felt sorry for him. My son had just realized that the last 5 years of his life had been a lie. Do the kids know? He asked. Of course not, Keisha answered quickly. It's not their fault. Not their fault? Robert grinned bitterly. They're living off the money you got for betraying your own clients. Their education, this house, our whole lives, all built on lies. Keisha was silent. What could she say? That she was stealing for her family? That she wanted to give her children a better future? But the price of that future was too high. Robert sat down slowly on the couch and covered his face with his hands. I saw his shoulders shake and realized he was crying. My grown 40-year-old son was crying like a little boy who had learned that Santa Claus didn't exist. Robert sat on the couch, still holding the pictures in his hands, and I could see how slowly the full implications of the revealed truth were reaching him. His world that had seemed so stable and successful was falling apart before his eyes. Keisha stood beside me, not knowing what to do with her hands, where to look, what to say. It was the first time I'd ever seen her completely confused. Mom, Robert said without raising his head, how long have you been collecting this? Almost 6 months, I answered calmly. I started in January, after the Christmas I spent alone. Keisha twitched, as if remembering the holiday when she'd forbidden her husband to invite her mother. At the time, she'd thought she'd won a victory by finally isolating me from my family. She couldn't have known that it was that loneliness that made me act. At first, I just wanted to understand, I continued, who the woman was who so easily turned my son against his mother. I thought maybe I could find a way to mend the relationship. Robert raised his eyes and looked at me. There was guilt in his gaze. He knew he'd let his wife go too far, that he'd betrayed his mother for the sake of dubious family peace. I started simple. I sat down in the chair across from the couch, setting the box beside me. I learned about Keisha's career, read articles about her cases in professional journals, and I noticed some strange things. What kind of things? Robert asked. Too many wins, I replied. Too many lucky coincidences. Witnesses who changed their testimony at the last minute in favor of her clients. Documents that disappeared from opposing counsel's files. Court decisions that were made against obvious facts. Keisha was silent, but I could see the muscles in her face tense. She understood that every word I said was based on a careful study of her practice. Then I started digging deeper, I continued. It turned out that a 73-year-old retiree could have a lot of time for research. I studied all of Keisha's files for the last 5 years. All of them? Robert interjected. All public records, I confirmed. Court transcripts, decisions, appeals. And then I started talking to people. I remembered every one of those conversations. A former clerk, fired under bizarre circumstances after asking uncomfortable questions about paperwork. The secretary at the opposite firm who happened to hear suspicious phone conversations. A private investigator who was hired by a competitor's lawyer, but who suddenly defected to Keisha. People are eager to talk to older women, I said. We seem safe, non-threatening. No one suspects Grandma of industrial espionage. Keisha finally spoke. You had no right to... Right? I interrupted her. Did you have the right to destroy families for money? Did you have the right to betray your client's trust? That's not the same thing. Keisha tried to argue. This is my business, my job, and you're invading my privacy. Your business? I pulled another folder out of the box. Elizabeth Connor trusted you with her life. 40 years of marriage, and at 74, she ended up on the street because her lawyer sold her husband information. Robert picked up the folder and began to read. I could see the expression on his face change from bewilderment to horror. He was reading about how his wife had betrayed an elderly woman, leaving her practically destitute. Keisha, he said quietly, is this true? Robert, you don't understand. She tried to explain herself. The business of law is very complicated. Sometimes you have to make compromises. Compromises? Robert got up from the couch. You call betraying a client a compromise? I wanted to provide for our family, Keisha screamed. To give the kids a better life. Do you think you can earn an honest day's work for a house like this? For private school? For trips to Europe? That's it. The mask was finally off. Keisha admitted that she'd stolen for family wealth, for status, for the lifestyle she wanted to show to those around her. A better life? Robert looked at his wife with disgust. You built our prosperity on other people's misfortunes. Don't be naive, Keisha snapped at him. Everybody does it. Do you think your mother was honest all her life? You think there was no corruption in her generation? She tried to drag me into this mess, to justify her crimes by saying that everybody does it. But Robert knew me well enough to know I would never sell someone else's trust for money. Mom was a teacher for 40 years, he said coldly. She made a penny and never complained. And you've been stealing. I didn't steal, Keisha screamed. I was getting paid for information. For information that belonged to your clients, I interjected. For secrets that people trusted you with as a lawyer. Keisha turned to me, hatred flashing in her eyes. Now she wasn't trying to be polite or diplomatic. Her true face was exposed, and it was disgusting. You think you're better than that? She hissed. You've been spying on me, poking around my affairs, breaking the law. I was gathering public information, I replied calmly. I read court records, talked to people who wanted to tell the truth. I didn't bribe anyone. I didn't steal anything. And the photos? And the tapes of conversations? Keisha pointed to the box. Is that legal too? The photos were taken in public places, I answered. And recordings? Well, some people record their conversations for their own safety, especially when they suspect they're being played unfairly. Keisha realized that her former partners were backing themselves up by recording conversations. Perhaps they didn't trust her completely either, realizing that a woman who betrays her clients might betray them as well. You know what's most interesting? I continued. All those people you worked with weren't so stupid. They realized that they were dealing with an unscrupulous lawyer and took precautions. What are you saying? That I'm not the only one who has records of your transactions. I explained. These people were taking precautions too, and if it goes to trial, they're not likely to defend you. Keisha's face paled even more. She realized she was in complete isolation. The clients she had betrayed would want justice. The partners she'd partnered with would turn her in first to save themselves. No one would defend a corrupt lawyer. Mom, Robert said, what now? What are you going to do with this information? That was the big question. 6 months of work, lots of evidence, shattered illusions. And then what? Keisha waited for an answer, too, her hands clutching the back of her chair. What do you think I should do? I asked my son. I don't know, he answered honestly. It's your decision. At that moment, footsteps sounded upstairs, and Haley's voice reached us. Mom, what's wrong? Why are you yelling? We all froze. The kids were awake, hearing our voices, feeling the tension in the house. Now they would come downstairs and see their parents in open conflict. Ethan, let's go see, came the voice of a boy. No, Keisha said sharply. Stay in your rooms. But it was already too late. 2 small figures in pajamas appeared on the stairs. Haley walked in front, holding her little brother's hand tightly. They looked scared and confused. What's going on? Haley asked, looking at the scattered papers. Why is Daddy crying? Robert quickly wiped his eyes and tried to smile at the children, but the smile was crooked and unconvincing. Keisha stood like a statue, not knowing what to say. It's no big deal, darlings, I tried to reassure my grandchildren. It's just grown-ups talking about important things. And why does Mommy have such a face? Ethan asked. She looks sick. The children sensed the lie. They could see that something serious was going on in the house, that their stable world was cracking. Haley stepped closer and saw the pictures on the table. Mom, who is that next to you? She asked, pointing to a picture of a man she didn't recognize. That's, that's a coworker, Keisha mumbled. And why is he hugging you? The girl continued to ask. Daddy said that you don't hug at work. Innocent, childish questions cut deeper than any accusation. Haley didn't realize she was seeing evidence of her mom's crimes, but she intuitively felt that something wrong was going on. Kids, go to bed, Robert said tiredly. We'll talk tomorrow. But we want to be with Grandma, objected Ethan. We see her so rarely. Tomorrow, repeated his father. Now is not the time. The children reluctantly headed for the stairs, but Haley turned around. Grandma Dorothy, are you coming tomorrow? All the adults fell silent. Am I coming tomorrow? Will this family have tomorrow? Will Keisha be a free woman tomorrow or a person facing charges? We'll see, honey, I answered cautiously. The children disappeared upstairs, and the living room was silent again. It was just the three of us, three adults, with a box of documents between them that could destroy a family. So, Keisha said, trying to pull herself together, what do you want? How much? She still thought that the case could be solved with money, that each person had a price, and you just had to bargain properly. Money, she repeated. Silence costs money. Tell me how much. Keisha, shut up, Robert said with disgust. You don't realize who you're dealing with. But she didn't listen to her husband. The familiar patterns were working in her brain. The problem, the threat, the cost of the solution. She couldn't understand that some things are neither bought nor sold. 100,000, she said. That's all I have in my personal accounts. I remained silent, looking at this woman who, even in a moment of collapse, continued to think in terms of transactions. 200, Keisha upped the ante. I'll take out a loan against the house. Keisha, stop it, Robert asked. 300, his wife wouldn't listen. That's all I can get quickly, but you'll have to wait a couple months. She was ready to ruin the family to buy my silence. She was willing to mortgage the house her kids lived in to keep her secret. 500,000, she screamed in desperation. I'll sell the house. We'll move into an apartment, but you promise not to say anything. Robert looked at his wife with horror. He saw how far she was willing to go to cover up her crimes. He saw that she was willing to sacrifice everything, the house, the stability of the children, the family's well-being, but was not prepared to take responsibility for her actions. 1,000,000, Keisha screamed. I'll find a way to get 1,000,000. Just don't ruin my career. Her career. That's what was really important to her. Not her family, not her children, not her husband. Career, status, money. That's what she was willing to do anything for. I stood up from my chair and took the box in my hands, feeling all three of us, Robert, Keisha, and myself, frozen in anticipation of my next words. The air in the living room was thick with tension, like a thunderstorm. Outside the window, the wind swayed the branches of the trees, and their shadows flickered across the walls, creating bizarre patterns. Mom, Robert said gently, let's sit down and talk about this calmly. Maybe we can find a solution that will suit everyone. My son was still hoping for a compromise. He was a kind man who believed that any problem could be solved peacefully if all parties showed goodwill. But he didn't realize that goodwill had to be mutual, and Keisha had demonstrated a complete lack of that quality for years. Would that be okay with everyone? I asked. What do you suggest, son? Forget about the fact that your wife ruined dozens of people's lives for money? Mom, I know you're upset. Upset? I interrupted him. Robert, I'm not upset. I'm angry. Angry that this woman has made my life hell for 5 years. Angry that she turned you against your own mother. Angry that she's the reason I hardly see my own grandchildren. Robert lowered his eyes. He knew I was telling the truth. He knew I'd let my wife go too far in isolating me from my family. But, Mom, he tried to object, think of the children. If this goes public, Haley and Ethan will suffer. At school, among their friends. About the kids? I looked over at Keisha, who was pale as a sheet. Was your wife thinking about kids when she was stealing money from customers? Was she thinking about building their well-being on other people's misfortunes? Keisha remained silent, realizing that anything she said would only make the situation worse. She stood in the corner with her back against the wall, as if trying to blend in and become invisible. Robert, I continued, your wife was stealing from the elderly, old people like me, taking their homes, their savings, their last hope for justice. And you're suggesting I forget that for the sake of family peace? My son clenched his fists. I could see him struggling with different feelings: love for his children, remnants of affection for his wife, resentment at her actions, guilt toward his mother. It was an uphill battle, and the outcome was far from certain. Maybe Keisha will mend her ways, he said uncertainly. Maybe she'd realize her mistakes and get better. I laughed, but it was a bitter laugh. Robert, she just offered me $500,000 to keep quiet. She's willing to bankrupt her family to cover up her crimes. Is that called making amends? Robert looked at his wife, and I could see the last bit of hope fading in his eyes. Keisha had really shown her true colors, the face of a man who put money before family and career, before integrity. Keisha, he said quietly, tell me honestly, do you regret what you did? Keisha opened her mouth to answer, but I saw in her eyes not remorse, but calculation. She was thinking about which answer would help her more in this situation. Of course I'm sorry, she said finally. I never meant to hurt the family. Family? I asked her again. And to your clients? Elizabeth Connor, who was homeless at 74? The Thompsons who lost their home because of your betrayal? Keisha was silent. She didn't regret her sacrifices. She only regretted getting caught. You see, Robert, I told my son, she hasn't changed. She won't change. To her, people are just a means to a profit. Mom, Robert came over to me and put his hands on my shoulders. What do you want us to do? Tell me straight. Finally, he asked the right question. What do I want? Justice? Revenge? Or just recognition that I have rights in this family? I want to be treated like a human being, I said. Like a mother, like a grandmother, not an unfortunate relic of the past. But Mom, for 5 years, I interrupted him. For 5 years, your wife did everything she could to cut me out of your life. Rare visits, short conversations, forbidding the children to talk to me. And today she called me a disgrace to the family and told me to get out. Robert flinched. Apparently, he hadn't heard his wife say those words, but he realized from my tone that they had been spoken. Did she say that? He asked, turning to Keisha. Robert, I was upset. She tried to justify herself. I didn't think I was saying it. You didn't? I pulled a tape recorder out of the box and turned it on. Keisha's voice came through the speaker. You're a disgrace to the family. Get out. The words sounded crisp, clear, without the slightest hint that they were spoken in a burst of emotion. Robert turned pale. He heard the contempt and hatred with which his wife had spoken of his mother. He heard what he probably suspected but didn't want to admit. Did you record our conversation? Keisha asked indignantly. Did you think your words could just be forgotten? I replied. That you could insult someone and then pretend it never happened? Keisha realized she had fallen into another trap. Her every word, every action was being recorded and could be used against her. I was more prepared for this confrontation than she realized. So, I said, setting the box on the coffee table. You have a choice. More specifically, you have a choice, Keisha. What choice? She whispered. Either you start treating me with respect, or those documents go to the prosecutor's office and the bar. This is blackmail, Keisha shouted. No, I replied calmly. It's justice. You blackmailed me for 5 years with your treatment of my children, forbidding them to communicate with me, turning them against me, making my life unbearable. Now it's my turn to make conditions. Robert stood between us, and I could see he was torn. On one side was his wife, the mother of his children, the man he had lived with for 5 years. On the other was the mother who had given birth to him and raised him, who had loved him unconditionally all his life. Mom, what if Keisha agrees? What exactly do you want? I want to see my grandchildren whenever I want, I said. I want them to call me, to come visit. I want to be a part of their lives' birthdays, school parties, family trips. That's not possible, Keisha said quickly. Why not? I asked. Because then the kids would know that Grandma is a normal person, that I can give them the love and attention they lack at home. Our kids have everything they need, Keisha countered. Everything except the right to be children, I replied. Everything except the ability to make mistakes, to laugh, to play. You've turned them into little robots who are afraid to make a move. I'm raising them right. The right way? I pointed to the staircase where the frightened children stood half an hour ago. They're afraid of you, Keisha. Your own children are afraid to ask the wrong question, afraid to show emotion. Robert nodded. He, too, had seen how tense the children were in their mother's presence, how cautious they were. One more condition, I continued. No decisions about the children without my involvement. Schools, trips, clubs. I want to know and have a say. You're out of your mind, Keisha blurted out. There are children. My grandchildren, I corrected, and I have a right to be a part of their upbringing. You don't have any rights, Keisha screamed. Legally, you're nobody. Grandmothers have no legal rights to grandchildren. Legally, no, I agreed, but I have moral rights, and the materials in this box. Keisha realized she was backed into a corner. The legal knowledge she was so proud of wasn't helping her in a situation where the facts of her own crimes were working against her. Robert, she turned to her husband, you can't let this happen. She wants to destroy our family. Destroy? Robert interjected. Mom wants to be part of the family. And you. You've already destroyed everything I believed in. There was so much pain in his voice. I felt sorry for my son. He loved Keisha, or thought he did, made plans with her, dreamed of a future, and now all those dreams have been shattered. I don't want to destroy your family, I said softly. I want to be a part of it. I want my grandchildren to know they have a grandmother who loves them. And if I say no, Keisha asked, then tomorrow morning copies of all the documents will be forwarded to the appropriate authorities, I answered without hesitation. In a week, you'll lose your law license, and in a month, you'll be in jail. Keisha covered her face with her hands. She realized she'd lost. All her plans, her whole career, her whole carefully constructed world was crumbling before her eyes. I need time to think, she said. You have until morning, I said. I want your answer in the morning. And if I agree, will you guarantee silence? If you abide by the terms, yes. But on the first offense, all materials will become public. Keisha nodded, realizing she had no other choice. She was a smart woman, and she knew I wasn't bluffing. There was enough evidence for a criminal case, and there was no way to hide it. Robert, she said to her husband, will you support me? Robert was silent for a long time, looking at his wife and his mother. Finally, he shook his head slowly. I will support the decision that is best for the children and for Mom. She's suffered too long because of your selfishness. Keisha realized she was alone. Her husband was no longer her ally. The children loved their grandmother more than they feared their mother, and she herself stood on the edge of a precipice with evidence of her own crimes in the hands of the enemy. All right, she said quietly. I agree to your terms. Very well, I replied. Then tomorrow I'll come over for lunch with my grandchildren, and we'll talk quietly about the plans for the near future. Keisha nodded without looking up. Her world had changed forever, and she understood that. There would be different rules in the family now, rules where Grandma had rights, and the children had the opportunity to love all the relatives. Robert came over to me and hugged me, really tightly, like he had when I was a child. I'm sorry, Mom, he whispered, for all these years, for not protecting you. It doesn't matter, son, I said, stroking his hair. What mattered was that things would be different now. And I knew it was true. The family illusions were gone, but in their place was the opportunity to build a real relationship based on honesty and mutual respect. I pulled away from my son's embrace and looked at the clock on the wall. The time was approaching 11, quite late for a family with young children, but the events of the evening were too important to pay attention to the usual routine. Outside the window, Fort Wayne was slowly falling asleep. The lights in the houses were going out one by one, and in this living room, a 5-year war between two women of different generations was coming to an end. Keisha still stood against the wall, her back leaning against it as if the wall were the only support in a collapsing world. Her face had taken on a waxy hue, and her eyes stared into the void. She realized the magnitude of what had happened, not only that her secrets had been exposed, but that the balance of power in the family had changed forever. She wasn't the only one making decisions anymore. I have to go home, I said, adjusting the strap of my purse on my shoulder. Mom, why don't you stay? Robert suggested. We have a guest room. The offer was sincere. I could see it in his eyes. My son really wanted me to stay, so we could spend more time together. But I shook my head. Staying the night would mean I was accepting their hospitality as a favor, and I wasn't going to be an object of favor in my son's house anymore. Thank you, but no, I replied. I have my own home, my own life. It's just that now that life will include you. I leaned over and picked up a box from the coffee table. Keisha flinched when she saw the movement. I guess she was hoping I'd forget the paperwork so she could pretend it hadn't happened. But I wasn't about to leave the evidence out of her hands. I'll keep this box, I said calmly, as a reminder of our arrangement. But I agreed to your terms, Keisha said, her voice desperate. Agreeing is easy, I said. Keeping promises is harder, especially when those promises go against your habits. Keisha realized that there would never be trust between us, that her every move would be monitored, her every word controlled. Her freedom was conditional, and those conditions were harsh. What if I honored the arrangements? She asked. After a while, would you destroy these materials? I looked at her for a long moment. Even in defeat, she was thinking about how to regain control of the situation, how to eventually become the full mistress of the family again. Keisha, I said patiently, you're still missing the point. This isn't a temporary measure. This is a new reality. You've lost the right to sole control of my grandchildren's lives forever. But they're my children, she flared up. Yes, your children, I agreed. But they're also my grandchildren and Robert's children. And family is not the dictatorship of one person, even if that person is a mother. Robert stood nearby and listened to our dialogue without interfering. I could see that he was thinking about what he had heard, trying to figure out what their family life would look like under the new conditions. For 5 years, he'd lived by the rules Keisha had set. Now, those rules were changing. Tomorrow, I said, heading for the exit, I'll be there for lunch, and the kids and I will go to the park or the museum. It'll be up to them, not you. What if the kids have plans? Keisha asked. Classes, activities? We'll find another time, I said. But grandmother time will always be on their schedule. That's out of the question. Keisha bit her lip. It was hard for her to accept that her iron grip on her family was loosening, that now another person's opinion would have to be considered when planning the children's lives. What about the trip to Europe? She asked. What about it? I asked. You're not coming with us, are you? I stopped at the door and turned to her. There was hope in her question. Maybe she would be able to retain complete authority over the children on distant trips. I'll go if I want to, I answered simply, and if the kids want me to. And if I don't want to go, then you can go on your own. But they'll explain to the children that Grandma had the option to go, and she made the choice. But, but it's a family trip, Keisha tried to object. Exactly, I agreed. It's a family trip, and I'm part of the family, whether you like it or not. Keisha lowered her head. She was beginning to realize that any attempt to exclude me from family life would now be met with resistance, and not just mine. Robert wasn't likely to let his wife isolate his mother again. I reached the hallway and began to put on my coat. My movements were calm, measured. I wasn't in a hurry. There was nowhere else to hurry. The years when every visit with my family was a brief gift that could be taken away at any moment were over. Mom, Robert said, coming toward me, I'll walk you to the car. I don't have a car, I reminded him. I came by cab. Then I'll drive you home. I shook my head. Thanks, but I'll call a cab. You need to stay here and take care of some family business. Robert understood what I meant. He was going to have a difficult conversation with his wife about the future of their relationship, about whether the marriage could be saved after this revelation, how to explain the changes in the family to the children. I pulled out my cell phone and called a cab. The driver promised to be there in 15 minutes, just enough time to complete all the necessary conversations. What am I going to tell the kids tomorrow? Keisha asked, appearing in the hallway. The truth, I answered, that Grandma would be coming to visit more often now, that she would be involved in their lives, that the family was bigger. And if they ask why it was different before, you could say that adults sometimes make mistakes, I suggested, and that now you're correcting mistakes. Keisha nodded, but I could see that she was having trouble accepting that wording. Admitting her mistakes meant admitting that she'd been wrong for 5 years, that all her attempts to isolate the children from their grandmother had been unfair and cruel. Outside the window, I heard the sound of a car pulling up. My cab had arrived right on time. I grabbed my purse and headed for the door, but Robert stopped me. Mom, he said quietly, thank you. For what, son? For not giving up, for fighting for us. I hugged him again, but briefly, without sentimentality. The time for tearful hugs and mutual forgiveness had not yet come, if ever. So far, there had only been a change of power, a redistribution of influence in the family. Real reconciliation took time and proof that the new rules would be followed. Goodbye, I said to Keisha. I'll see you tomorrow. She didn't answer, just nodded. In her eyes, I saw a mixture of fear, anger, and humility. She had lost, and it was painful for her, but she was smart enough to realize resisting now would only make her situation worse. I walked out of the house and headed for a waiting cab. The evening air was fresh and cool, a pleasant change from the stuffy atmosphere of the family squabbles. Behind me was the house, where difficult conversations were taking place. where illusions were being shattered and new relationships were being built. "Where are we going?" the driver asked when I got into the car. I gave him my address and leaned back in the seat. The box of papers was in my lap, heavy as the stone I'd been carrying around in my heart all these months. But now it was my protection, my assurance that the past wouldn't happen again. The car started, and I looked out the window at Fort Wayne at night. The city slept a peaceful sleep, unaware that a small but important war had just ended in a house. A war between the past and the future, between family tradition and modern ambition, between love and control. I had won that war, but victory did not bring me joy. Too much time had been lost, too much pain inflicted on both sides. But now I had the opportunity to build my relationship with my grandchildren anew, based on honesty and mutual respect. The box in my lap reminded me that power requires responsibility. I was now in control of my son's family situation, but that meant I was responsible for the outcome. The children had to be happier, not just moved from one dictatorship to another. The car stopped in front of my house, small, modest, but native. I paid the driver and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The house greeted me with silence and familiar smells. There was no expensive furniture or modern design here, but there was history here, my family's history. I set the box on the living room table and stared at it for a long time. Tomorrow, this box will remain here in my home as a reminder that justice sometimes comes to those who are willing to fight for it. And I will go to my grandchildren's house, not as a guest tolerated out of politeness, but as an equal member of the family. Relationships with Keisha will never be warm. Too much has been said, too much has happened, but they would become honest. We both knew where we stood, what we could count on, what our rights and responsibilities were. It was better than pretense and false politeness. Robert would gradually come back to me. I had no doubt about that. My son was a good man, just tangled up in the net of other people's ambitions. Now he would have a chance to sort himself out, to realize what he really wanted from life. And the children. Children will get what they have always needed, the opportunity to love all members of the family, not choosing between mom and grandma. The opportunity to be children, not projects to fulfill their parents' plans. I turned off the light in the living room and went to the bedroom. Tomorrow was the beginning of a new phase of my life, a phase where I was not a petitioner, but an equal participant in family relationships, a stage when my rights were protected not by pleading and persuasion, but by real power. The box of documents remained in the living room, a reminder that justice sometimes comes in the most unexpected form, and that a 73-year-old grandmother could be a more dangerous opponent than ambitious daughters-in-law realize. The balance of power had changed forever, and that was just the beginning.